Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Wednesday, August 16th, 2023. Making a podcast people hate. Today, I'm going to talk about some data from our upcoming study, The Podcast Landscape in America, and talk about the power of focusing a podcast to a specific audience over generic, broad-reaching demographics. But first, on Wednesday, August 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern, Sounds Profitable will debut its newest research in a live webinar. Produced in partnership with Signal Hill Insights, we're proud to present The Podcast Landscape in America, a study of over 2,400 Americans 18 plus that aims to understand why they do or do not listen to podcasts. Register now with the link in the description at soundsprofitable.com or the link that is in the show notes here. Last week, I talked about the song of the summer and the Joe Rogan problem. Well, this week, as I pore over the data for our upcoming new research project, The Podcast Landscape in America, I wanted to quantify exactly what I was talking about. Now, prepare to be shocked, unless you've been looking at podcast data for the past 4 years. So our project surveyed over 2,400 Americans ages 18 plus and asked both podcast listeners and non-listeners alike about their perceptions of the media. Now, one of my favorite questions to ask, as I've spoken about in the past, is what podcasts do you listen to on a regular basis? Now, in this study, we asked listeners to name their top 3, if they had 3, favorite podcasts, which the diligent team at our partners Signal Hill Insights hand-coded and tabulated. Now, the results, I have to tell you, they're nearly identical in every way to what I saw for years behind the scenes at Edison Podcast Metrics. The top 10 kind of looks like the top 10. But I'm going to give you the top 10 here, followed by the percentage of listeners in our study that named the show as one of their 3 favorite podcasts. And number 1 is Joe Rogan at 16%. Now, behind that, The Daily at 3%, Crime Junkie and The Ben Shapiro Show at 2%, as well as This American Life at 2%. And then at 1%, Dateline NBC, Caller Daddy, Dan Bongino, Distractable, Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, The Breakfast Club, and Smartless. Now, you knew that Rogan was number 1, sure, but did you know by how much? Now, before you get carried away with that data, there's a couple of things here. The human brain wants to look at all the 1s and 2s on this graph and diminish them as small numbers. They're not small numbers. They reflect a percentage of all the people who have ever listened to a podcast, and even at 1%, that would exceed the audience of most non-football TV shows. Second, the question we asked isn't what did you listen to this week, it's what are your favorite podcasts? And that's a construction that can tend to inflate Rogan's impact. It's a popularity contest and not a listening metric. Still, it's a pretty good question. Now, in last week's podcast, I talked about the perceptions that people have about podcasting when Rogan is what they think about. And, there's not really anything actionable there. But I want to put my audience development hat on here and talk about what Rogan does right that so few in podcasting really get. Super serving a core audience. Now, Rogan's core is exactly who you think they are, young men who spend a lot of time on YouTube and followed Rogan to Spotify. They do listen to other podcasts, as it turns out. But Rogan is certainly a standard bearer for many of them. You probably have a very clear picture in your head of who a Rogan fan is when they're at home, what they look like, listen to, read, and maybe even believe. You have this because Rogan is crystal clear about attracting a very specific audience, even at the exclusion of others. It is this simple fact of marketing that makes me wince anytime I hear someone tell me that their podcast is for everyone or anyone with an interest in whatever the topic is. A topic interest is not an organizational principle. It's not specific enough. Now imagine you were doing a podcast about My Little Pony toys and collecting. There are 3 distinct groups at least who would be interested in the topic. 9-year-old girls, 60-year-old dudes with collectible shops, and bronies. Now I guarantee you cannot make a podcast that appeals to all 3 of these segments. And by the way, the bronies care most about the brand. It's why My Favorite Murder is so good. It's a topic, true crime, but it has a specific point of view. Karen and George's comedic take on, murder. Not everyone is going to like it. But if you like it, you really like it. The famous hotelier Ian Schrager calls it 1 + 1 = 3. You build something most people will hate, but a few people love, and love enough to tell their friends about. For a podcast, that means having as clear a picture about your topic area, point of view, and ideal listener, listener, singular, as you possibly can, and then making the podcast that human would love, even if most people would hate it. As long as Rogan is speaking to that one listener and producing content that polarizes people into camps of love and hate, he's going to print money. The worst thing you can say about a podcast is not that people hate it. It's that nobody loves it. Now, here's the hard part. Sometimes you have to lose an existing audience to make these kinds of creative choices. That's tough to take, especially when downloads go down and unhappy emails roll in. It requires some bravery, a strong stomach, and most importantly, the knowledge that there is a there with the audience segment you're ultimately trying to attract. And I think we're all capable of this. It just requires clarity and hard choices. But we need more Rogans. We need more podcasts that spark passion with clear points of view, that plant flags for people to rally around. And maybe this is the hardest question to ask yourself as a podcaster. Would anyone rally around this flag? There are absolutely podcasts out there that I rally around, support financially, and even belong to Discord communities for, and I hate Discord. I feel like I'm their only listener. The show was made for me. And if podcasting is going to start to fatten up the right side of that graph I described, more shows are going to have to make those creative leaps and hard decisions. Thanks again for listening to today's podcast, Making a Podcast People Hate. This episode was built using Spooler and hosted on Art19. I'm Tom Webster. I'll see you next time. And if you're going to Podcast Movement in Denver next week, I'll see you there.